I used to believe there were truths the Imperium kept hidden only because they were too vast for ordinary minds to carry, secrets wrapped in sigils and sealed under oath, catalogued on some forgotten data slate, in a vault beneath Terra. But I know now that some truths are hidden, not out of reverence but out of mercy, because no one wants to face the reality that a mind can be stolen long before a body ever disappears. No one wants to admit that suffering can begin days, even weeks before the first claw tears flesh. If you had told me that once, I might have dismissed it as fear-mongering born of dark corners of void ships and manufactorums. Now I know better. Now I know the truth too intimately to deny it, because I have lived inside it. And perhaps if you hear what I have to say, you might understand why no survivor of a Genestealer encounter ever speaks without trembling. If you are listening, I ask only that you lend a moment's attention, and if this tale compels you, share it, speak of it, and carry it forward. The darkness in the void grows bolder whenever knowledge is left to rot in silence, and perhaps your voice is one more fragile torch against the tide. Support the channel however you see fit, keep this archive alive, and maybe together we can stop one more world from repeating my mistakes. When the first symptoms came, I refused to call them that. They were too soft, too subtle, a lingering ache down my spine, a sense that someone stood behind me whenever I paused too long in a corridor, a tightening in the chest that felt like grief for something I could not name. On Casimir and Quintus, sensations like that were common enough. Our hive's lower tiers churned with recycled air and chemical runoff, and the administratum's health inspections were as ceremonial as their public prayers. I told myself it was nothing. Everyone does. Because the alternative, that something alien has marked you, is a thought the human mind instinctively rejects. It feels unnatural to imagine that a single moment of contact could alter your fate so completely. But that is the cruelty of the Genestealer's touch. It does not begin with bodily horror. It begins with emotional erosion. I remember the night the first dream came. In it, I walked through the underhive where I'd grown up, but the corridors were impossibly smooth, curved like the inside of a vast organic shell. The lights flickered in a rhythm that felt familiar, almost comforting, and though I searched for the source, I knew somehow that it came from within me. The deeper I walked, the warmer the air grew, as if I was approaching a presence that wanted me close. I never reached it because the dream dissolved each time I neared the final turn. I woke, drenched in sweat and confusion, heart hammering as if I had run from something rather than toward it. I told myself the dream meant nothing. I told myself many things in those days, all of them lies made out of fear. There were moments, though, when the veil slipped. A coworker brushed past me in the refinery line, and for a fraction of a second, I smelled something sweet beneath the usual promethium stench, an alien musk, soft and chilling. I recoiled, but he seemed unchanged, unaware. Or perhaps he was like me, pretending. There are millions in a hive who pretend every day. We tell ourselves that the scratching we hear in the pipes belongs to rats, not something with purpose. We tell ourselves that the shadows we glimpse in peripheral vision are tricks of failing lumen strips. The lie becomes easier with repetition, until one day you can't remember when the pretending began. I was assigned to a shipment crew that week, hauling crates of refined promethium to the loading docks, where the Astra Militarum convoys cycled in and out. We rotated through shifts that blurred into one another, marked only by the strain in our muscles and the constant hiss of refinery vents. On the third day, while moving a crate thick with frost from coolant lines, I felt my knees weaken. Not from the weight, though I blamed it on that at first. It was a wave of cold dread that rose through my spine, followed by a tug in my mind like a string being gently pulled. I heard nothing with my ears, yet I felt a whisper coil around my thoughts, a suggestion rather than a word, impossible to describe but unmistakable. I froze, hands slipping against the metal. My supervisor shouted at me to move, and the noise snapped the sensation in half. I told him the crate had shifted in my grip, and he cursed me for carelessness. But he didn't look closely. No one ever looks closely, because if they did, they might see the truth behind the eyes of workers like me. They might see the dilation that lingers too long under bright lights, or the tension in the jaw when someone mentions purity inspections. They might see that the afflicted can no longer trust themselves to speak freely. You have to understand something. Genestealers do not merely infiltrate bodies, they infiltrate lives. Every routine, every relationship, every fleeting interaction becomes a battleground between instinct and intrusion. And the tragedy is that the victim never realizes they've lost until the final moment. When resistance is no longer possible, I felt it growing in me day by day. A presence that did not yet speak in words but in impulses, small ones at first. I started taking longer routes to work, ones that passed through the older sections of the hive where Maintenance crews seldom ventured. I found myself lingering near rusted bulkheads that pulsed faintly with warmth. I told myself it was residual heat from conduits, but part of me knew better. The dreams grew stronger, more vivid. I began to feel the texture of the floor underfoot, wet, sinewy like living flesh. The air thickened with a humid breath, and I heard movement in the darkness beside me, not hostile but expectant, patient. A silhouette followed me in every dream, tall and impossibly thin, with limbs that extended just beyond what human joints should allow. Its hands, if they were hands, traced shapes in the air like sigils, and I felt each gesture within my chest. The worst part was that the figure never frightened me. Instead, it filled me with a strange sense of belonging, as if I had been waiting for it all my life. Reality started to mirror the dreams. I would wake with the sensation that someone had been standing at the foot of my bunk. The air would carry a faint metallic sweetness that faded quickly, like a scent carried from a distant chamber. Each morning I found myself less concerned with the routines that once anchored me. Food tasted bland, water too warm, the chatter of workers abrasive to my ears. Every voice felt intrusive except the whisper beneath my thoughts, the one I could not escape. One night after an especially long shift, I took a route home through a maintenance tunnel that had been sealed off years prior due to structural instability. I had never walked through it before, yet I knew each bend instinctively. The lights were dead, but I moved through the darkness without fear. The tunnel descended deeper than I expected, and the air cooled until I could see my breath. My skin prickled with anticipation, though I could not explain why. When I reached a bend in the passage, I saw something imprinting itself in the dust, a pattern that seemed natural at first, until I realized they were footprints. Not human, too wide, too many points of contact, fresh. I stopped. My heart pounded in my throat, and for the first time in weeks, a sliver of my old self clawed through the fog. I turned to run, but the whisper tightened, gently, insistently around my mind. I felt it drag my gaze back toward the darkness. And in that moment, something moved. A shape peeled itself from the wall, unfolding with impossible silence. Its limbs clung to the surface like a thing born to shadows. A crest rose from its skull, smooth and ridged, and its eyes, dark, reflective, found mine with chilling precision. The Genestealer was beautiful, in the way a venomous serpent is beautiful, lethal, fluid, inevitable. Forearms flexed as if testing the air, and its talons scraped softly against the stone. It didn't charge. It didn't roar. It simply watched me, and I felt the whisper transform into something sharper. An invitation. A command. I wanted to scream, but the sound died in my throat. My legs buckled, and I dropped to my knees. As the creature approached with a grace that defied its monstrous frame, each step felt synchronized with my heartbeat, as if it pulsed in tandem with me. When it reached me, it lowered itself with terrifying precision, its breath cold against my face. Time fractured. I felt the world collapse around the edges of my vision, and a sensation like ice and fire simultaneously tore through my mind. It wasn't pain, not exactly. It was revelation. A violent reminder that my thoughts had never been mine to begin with. When I woke, I lay in the tunnel alone, trembling, throat raw though I had made no sound. Hours had passed, though it felt like only moments. I stumbled home in a daze, my limbs weak, my mind hollowed out. But the whisper was now a voice, soft, comforting, and inescapable. It spoke without words, shaping my thoughts around its own, weaving itself into my identity. I felt a sickening warmth in my chest, not from fear, but from acceptance. That is the paradox of the Genestealers' embrace. It strips away your terror by making you complicit. Your suffering becomes a devotional act, a slow surrender to something greater, and that is why those taken by Genestealers do not die quickly. Their suffering stretches across weeks, months, sometimes years. Every day becomes a conflict between memory and indoctrination, between the remnants of your humanity and the alien certainty blooming within you. And the worst part, the cruelest part, is that you begin to love the thing that has destroyed you. Work became a blur after that. I showed up to my shifts out of reflex, not necessity. My coworkers noticed the change, though they pretended not to. Those who disappeared were always spoken of in hushed tones, and no one ever asked questions loud enough for anyone else to hear. I found myself drifting toward them, those who had been touched as I had. They recognized the new cadence in my voice, the distant look in my eyes. We were bound by something deeper than fear, deeper than blood. I felt a pull toward them each day, a gravitational force drawing us, together as if guided by a will older than humanity itself. The cult was not yet revealed then. It operated in whispers and glances, in coded gestures and unspoken promises. We gathered in abandoned manufacturing chambers where the walls were thick with grime and the air tasted of rust. We knelt before idols sculpted of bone and scrap metal, adorned with symbols that felt sacred even as they repulsed the remnants of my human mind. The Magus spoke to us in sermons that echoed within my skull, his voice oily and hypnotic, threading itself into the cracks left by the Genestealers' kiss. He preached of unity, of liberation from the burdens imposed by the Imperium. He spoke of a coming dawn when we would be uplifted by our starborn kin, when the suffering we endured would be rewarded tenfold. His words were soothing, intoxicating, but within them lay the seed of a truth more dreadful than any lie the Imperium had ever fed me. Our suffering had only just begun. To be taken by a Genestealer is to be trapped in a perpetual state of transformation. Your thoughts shift like sand beneath a rising tide. Your memories lose their edges, and your identity becomes a battlefield. Some fight it longer than others. I tried to for a time. There were moments when I glimpsed my old self reflected in a polished pipe or a puddle of coolant. He stared back at me with hollow eyes, pleading silently for release. But the voice inside me always drowned him out, soothing, consoling, promising me that resistance only prolonged the agony. The cult's influence seeped into every corner of the hive. Whole neighborhoods vanished overnight, their occupants slipping into the subterranean warrens where the patriarchs slumbered. Those left behind whispered of disappearances, of strange markings found near ventilation shafts and drainage tunnels. The Arbites investigated briefly, but their presence was a flicker, not a flame. They were swallowed by the hive's apathy as easily as they were swallowed by the cult. As the months passed, the dreams became indistinguishable from waking life. I found myself unable to remember the last time I felt fear. The suffering had dulled into a constant throb, like a wound that refused to heal yet no longer bled. The Magus assured us this was a sign of progress, of spiritual evolution, but beneath his words I sensed a growing urgency. The voice inside me pulsed with anticipation, and I knew that something monumental loomed just beyond the horizon. When the call finally came, I felt it erupt through the depths of my consciousness like a siren. Every cultist heard it at the same moment, a psychic tremor that rippled through the hive. The patriarch was awake. You cannot fathom what it is to stand in the presence of a being like that. The patriarch was a mountain of flesh and bone, coiled in a chamber carved into the depths of the hive like a womb. Its limbs were folded in impossible ways, its crest rising like a crown of polished chitin. Eyes ancient and alien settled upon each of us as we entered, and the voice in my mind became a chorus, harmonious, overwhelming, absolute. I felt myself unraveling thread by thread until only devotion remained. That is the final phase of Genestealer suffering, the obliteration of the self, the death of every memory, every fear, every doubt, until you exist only as a vessel for the will of the cult. I knelt before the patriarch, tears streaming down my face, not because I was afraid, but because something deep within me recognized that this was the final moment, the culmination of every whisper, every dream, every shred of pain that had carved itself into my soul. He reached for me with a taloned hand, and I felt my mind erupt in blinding ecstasy. There was no pain, no fear, only rapture. And then suddenly clarity, a fragment of who I had been surfaced just long enough for me to recognize the horror of what I had become. I saw the hive for what it truly was, a cradle of suffering, a breeding ground for corruption that had claimed countless lives before mine. I saw the countless victims still wandering the corridors above, oblivious to the fate awaiting them. And I understood with perfect, agonizing certainty that I was beyond salvation. Yet even now, as I recount these events, the voice still murmurs beneath my thoughts. It never fully leaves you, not even after you break free or think you have. It lingers like a phantom limb, a constant reminder that the Genestealer's touch is eternal. I do not know how long I can keep it at bay. I do not know if these words are truly mine or simply another message it wishes to spread through me. All I know is this: those taken by Genestealers do not suffer because they are weak. They suffer because they are human. Because humanity is fragile, and anything fragile can be reshaped, stolen, claimed. If you ever feel a whisper in the back of your mind, if you ever wake from a dream that feels too vivid, too warm, too loving, I beg you, run. Seek the light of the Emperor. Seek the nearest inquisitorial contact. Seek anything that can sever the thread before it tightens around your soul, because once the suffering begins, there is no turning back. There is only the slow, inevitable descent into a darkness that wears the mask of salvation. And the worst part, the part no one warns you about, is that a small, treacherous part of you will begin to welcome it.